Dude, thank you for coming on the show.
Mr. Nolan, thank you so much for having me.
First live pod for us. This is number 3 for you on the show, but
This is 3?
I have a rule. I'm never doing more than 3 in a row, at least, without doing one in person.
Third time is the charm.
Yeah.
Really? So we had the first one. That's when we did the impromptu?
Mm-hmm. And then, where it was literally just like, hey, are you free in 30? And they're like, yeah.
Yeah.
And I went to like my yurt in Montana and
It was sweet. The background was sweet. We had like rivaling backgrounds.
Yeah, Mexico and Montana.
Yeah, you were in like a hut in Montana. I was in the jungle.
And then the second one, we kind of did the same deal, and I think it was like January or something. Just caught up. I think you were stateside. It was
Really?
I think it was right before you went to wherever you were a couple months ago.
Well, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, it's funny. I have horrible memory loss. I have a multitude of factors, right? The TBIs. I was on SSRIs, and those absolutely shot my memory.
Yeah.
And then also probably like, smoking weed in college and then Accutane. But I've got total Swiss cheese memory, and it's crazy. And like, my buddy Eric lives with me. He's always like, dude, you literally remember nothing. But it's anyway.
What
little caveat there.
Can you bring this a little closer?
Yeah.
Bring it that should be good. What do you remember? Like, because obviously you remember some stuff. Is it just like different stuff that filters through, or what?
That's a great question.
Short term, long term.
It's the experiential memory that I've lost. So I can't remember experiences. I can remember facts, right? They just get like kind of embedded into my subconscious. I can remember concepts really well. I can remember facts really well and concepts really well. I cannot remember experiences that I've had. So like I was with my family recently, and they were talking about some trip that we had when I was a kid, and I was like, I have no recollection of it whatsoever. Wow. I don't remember going. And then there are some things that I do remember, but I remember them in the context of a snapshot. I remember them as if someone else were doing it. There's no really emotional connection to it. And it's something that I didn't really take seriously, but I never realized how formative it was to my development in my early 20s, because everything else in my life I had no true kind of emotional attachment to. And obviously I have emotional attachment to people and sentiment and stuff like that, but my experiences that would otherwise have a really strong emotional charge, that completely dissipated.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when people are working through, past experiences or, trauma for some people, the big thing that they try to do is remove the emotional charge. I have no emotional charge to all of my past experiences. Yeah. So I was able to just completely reinvent myself. And it's interesting. I never connected the dots, but I think that was such a huge factor in the new development of who I was when I was in my early 20s.
Yeah. Do you have like less baggage? Mm-hmm. And is that, you mentioned SSRIs, is that a direct result of SSRIs? Is that something that they do?
Yeah, well, some people have very adverse reactions to SSRIs. I had a pretty adverse reaction, especially when I was coming off of them in my early 20s. And I had horrible anhedonia for 2 years.
Which is basically just like lack of emotion or something like
inability to feel like emotion. So
like high or low?
High or low, exactly. Right? And a lot of people are like, oh, well, that's depression, get back on the SSRIs. It's not, right? Because when you're depressed, you feel sad. When you have anhedonia, you can't feel anything. And it kind of relegated me to a life of pretty much just intellectualism, right? Because there's no emotional charge to anything. Luckily I was somehow, some way able to pull out of it. Now it's not to the level that I'd like, but I can now have those emotional charges again, which is really important. We're emotional creatures. We're emotional beings. But yeah, I had an adverse reaction to SSRIs. There's people that have had way worse adverse reactions. Mine was just from being on them for so long. Yeah. But some people have horrible reactions where they completely use that faculty, the ability to connect with other people. They lose all of the sharpness that makes them them. And they also lose sexual function, which is really scary, permanently. So anyway, I honestly think the biggest thing that saved me, though, was just going in nature. Yeah. Literally living on the beach saved me.
That makes so much sense to me intuitively. I saw something on Instagram or something recently where there's this trend going around of SSRI. What was the video? It was that look when you're on SSRI, or
the
that SSRI
stare.
look. And it was just this girl, or no, it was how life be like on SSRIs. And it was just this girl, and it was going viral. And it was just this girl staring literally blank, death eyes almost, just blankly staring. And I've never taken SSRIs. I took Vyvanse every day for 7 years. So sort of another hand in terms of not the same, but I mean, certainly some stuff that comes with taking something that powerful for 7 years. But it was just interesting to me. I'm like, that seems like a miserable way to live.
Yeah.
To literally just be flatlined almost.
It's interesting, a lot of people have those problems when they're on SSRIs. They just become flatlined. When I was on SSRIs, it was fine. I actually really enjoyed it. Some people's brain chemistry is just different, right? Mm-hmm. So some people, if you're inhibiting the reuptake of a certain neurotransmitter, they're going to have a leveling out feeling, right? It's going to make them feel more balanced. Now, other people, if you already have a lot of excess activity, that's going to make you a little bit more sporadic and manic.
Yeah.
So I had no issues with it when I was on them. I was on them for a while. The one thing that it did cause issue with is I didn't care at all. So I was incredibly reckless.
Yeah.
I was incredibly reckless, and I was incredibly thrill-seeking. And I still am, but it was to another level. Now, the problem that I have with SSRIs in general, aside from the large risk of side effects, is the fact that it makes you feel good enough where you don't address the problems that may be causing your depression. So, are there use cases for SSRIs? Yeah. Do I think there's better antidepressants? Of course. Do I believe in the serotonergic hypothesis of depression? Not really. I think there's way better hypotheses. But it inhibits you from doing the work required to get out of feeling like shit because you feel fine. So you just suck it up. Now, if you're in a really bad situation that you can't change and you just have to get through it, that's when it might make sense to use some pharmacological intervention. But if depression is caused by a mismatch between you and your environment, or if it's because you're not doing something you know that you need to be doing, SSRIs are the worst thing that you can do. And my life really turned around, and my life was fine before, but my life really turned around, and I started my personal development journey when I got off of SSRIs, because that's when I'm like, oh shit, there's so many things in my life that I need to change.
What was the impetus for you, like, to get off them?
I graduated college, and I had I wanted to reinvent myself because I was in a very demanding position. I was working in cybersecurity. I had a software company that I co-founded, and I was responsible for a lot of other people. And this was me as like a 22-year-old kid. I've been working on it for like 2 years now, and it's like now I need to really level up. I'm sick of who I was in college. I loved college, and I didn't not like who I was in college, but you get bored. Yeah. And I think if you're peaking in college, like that was my biggest fear. So it's like, it's time for me to level up. I'm playing new games. And, one of those things that I wanted to do was just to get off of SSRIs. And so I did it. And it really wasn't that hard. The hardest thing, though, was trying to recreate your identity after the last X number of years being on a compound that changes who you are. No different than Vyvanse or Adderall.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is the worst part about pharmacological interventions in youth, is that you are forming your sense of self under the influence of a compound. So that was the hardest factor for me. Luckily, it came at a time where I was reinventing myself anyway, but the identity crisis that I had when I got off those, and so many things that I thought were who I was, were actually who I was in an SSRI-induced state, that was really, really difficult. And it took me a year to recalibrate. And really get my bearings on who I was. And I really didn't come back into myself until about 2 years after.
It reminds me of what you hear with women on birth control. They'll literally be attracted to like entirely different men when they're on and off birth control. And it's just like, that's the power of you talk about being like a completely different person. Like it literally, I don't even know what system that like affects, but it literally changes who they are. Yeah. Because of a pharmacological intervention.
Birth control is a crazy drug.
Yeah.
EE2. So it is binding to those estrogen receptors for way longer and way more importantly than typical estrogen or E2 would. Birth control is a nightmare. Birth control then gets peed out into our water system. Yeah. And that water gets recycled, and it does not get filtered out. So we're slowly accumulating EE2 in all of our municipal water systems, and we're drinking it. We're showering in it. You ever run through the sprinklers, you drink through a hose. There's probably some EE2 in there. Yeah, it's a nightmare. I mean, the whole entire pharmaceutical industry, it has merit. Yeah. But, my life was just absolutely ransacked by pharmaceuticals. Accutane. Accutane, the more I dig into it, the more I'm like, oh my God, this thing destroyed me.
So that's a good question. I never took Accutane. And I had several friends that did, and I vividly remember, like, honestly, off the top of my head, I'm thinking of 3 people, and they all had some similar physical not changes, but physical effects with like really dry skin and just stuff like that. And then all of them also had like different mental and psychological effects as well. So like, what actually is Accutane?
Accutane is just a orally available form of highly potent vitamin A. It's like retinol that you put on your skin, tretinoin. It's just bioavailable.
Really?
Yeah, but it's to the point where it's pretty much a chemotherapeutic agent in its ability to cause cell death.
Is it comparable to the amount that you'd find in like a liver?
No. I'm talking about like hypervitaminosis A. Oh, okay. So when you're on Accutane, because it's so toxic, you have to get labs every month to check to make sure that your liver's not failing.
Damn.
Yeah, and that's the least of my worries. It completely destroys your biliary system. So like bile, right? Your gallbladder, your pancreas with the enzymes, and then your liver. Like that is a really important digestion and detox pathway. A lot of people that take Accutane, they never recover their gut. Their gut never recovers, and they have problems for life. Same with SSRIs. Have been linked, like increased serotonin, linked to IBS. You know, you're with Luke, so Luke probably never shuts up about that.
That's exactly right.
But yeah, I mean, Accutane is a particularly dirty and dangerous drug. It is so poisonous to your mitochondria and the kynurenine pathway.
Interesting.
There's so many cases of Accutane-induced depression, right? There's post-Accutane syndrome as well, which has a lot of correlation with post-finasteride syndrome and post-SSRI sexual dysfunction.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of correlations there as well. And it causes hippocampal neurodegeneration. So like neurodegeneration in your hippocampus. And this is something that was interesting to me, right? Because I took Accutane and I took SSRIs. So I was like, okay, well, I should be fucked. And luckily I wasn't. I think that, you know, I like to think that I'm quite robust. You know, I can take a lot of shit and be fine. But Accutane causes neurodegeneration in your hippocampus. SSRIs potentially induce hippocampal neurogenesis.
Oh, okay.
So it's almost like two poisons create a, balance each other out. But, you know, that's also some of the nuance behind SSRIs as well, is a lot of people don't experience benefits from SSRIs until about 6 months in, even though the serotonin reuptake inhibition occurs immediately. And we believe that, or they say that that's because of the neurogeneration, the neurogenerative properties that may occur from SSRIs.
Interesting.
So looking back, and I'm like, maybe that did do something. But
maybe
anyway,
it was like good you took them at the same time if you're going to take them.
Maybe. I mean, realistically, I really wish I didn't take either.
Yeah.
Because my tinnitus is so bad, and that's from Accutane. Like right now,
That's
my ears,
from Accutane?
yeah, my ears are ringing
Really?
crazy. Yeah.
Why? How does that happen?
It damages like the small nerve fibers. It causes some form of like neuropathy.
And Accutane is specifically for acne, correct?
Yeah. So its objective is to dry out your sebocytes. Like,
Is that why people get super dry skin?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
See, I had one buddy, it's like all of the friends I'm thinking of that had that happen, and their acne did get better over time, but they also got dry skin. And then one of them particularly, he got like, he would like literally notice he stopped taking it before the dose was supposed to be whatever like period of time the doctor told him to take it, and he stopped taking it because he noticed that he was like literally isolating himself. He just like felt he like didn't want to hang out with people as much. I don't know if that's something that's like a common thing, but he was one of my good buddies too, and he is one of my good buddies, and he legitimately like he went from being like a let's hang out like all the time kind of guy to like I'm gonna go in my room type guy.
Yeah.
Is that something that's common?
I mean, social isolation is the first thing that an animal does when it's sick or dying, right? It separates itself from the herd. And I mean, there's a number of reasons for that. Like if anything's kind of pathogenic, you know, that makes sense. Like you don't want to, like, I think we forget the fact that we think and our sense of self is oftentimes extrapolated to our tribe, because that's what we evolved in. We never evolved as individuals. There's no such thing as like a lone wolf.
Yeah.
It's like a lone wolf would never pass on its genes. It takes a village. So I think socialization is a huge cue to something being up. And, you know, that's what all of these things are cues, right? You know, like with depression or whatever it is, with feeling like shit, with brain fog, with acne even, a lot of people take that as the end-all be-all. Like, that is the root cause. Like, I can't do this because I'm depressed. No, you're depressed because there's something wrong. And depression, in my opinion, you know, isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think a lot of people with depression means that they're just attuned. That natural calibration system that's supposed to signal when something's wrong is going off. And maybe you have a stronger signal than other people do. I noticed that because like I'm hypersensitive to a lot of my context and surroundings. I'm a hyper responder to things as well, both positive and negative. And that correlates a lot to people with ADHD. They typically have stronger senses. They have more acuity. That's not a bad thing, but you put them in an environment that's inherently toxic, those signals are going to go off because those are encoding for them to get into a different environment that has higher chance of survival.
Dude, we were talking about this last night at dinner. Because I'm the same way in terms of, you were talking about in the context of Mexico and like living in the jungle. I vividly, one of the reasons I love going to our hunting lease in middle of nowhere, Georgia, is that exact reason. Like going from Atlanta, where there's 7 million people, cars everywhere, phone lines, EMFs, all this stuff, bad, horrible air. Literally, like the second that I get off the county highway, or I mean, honestly, off the highway, but then when I get on the dirt roads and then we pull up to the camp, it's like I immediately feel better. And do you think that that's because of like the maybe not hyperstimulation, but like maybe being prone to hyperstimulation because of like the ADHD?
Yeah, a hyperacuity is what I call it. You're very like you respond extremely quickly and noticeably to stimuli, right? It's like spider senses, right? You know, it's like when Peter Parker gets his spider senses and then he's like in like the city and like everything's super loud and overstimulating. Like that's what happens when you're hyper attuned to something, right? So I think that's a factor. You know, some people just are able, we all came from nature, right? So like nature is our ideal environment. Some people have evolved or adapted to be able to live in a non-natural environment. But I mean, for me, it's like I notice it immediately. Like even I live relatively in nature now, but like the other day I went out and like lived in real nature, night and day difference immediately. And like you got to really kind of learn to be an observer of that, because most people never observe. They just do, right? They never take a step back, and they don't know how to segment their mind and be like it's like in business, right? And I think that's where I got it from, because I was able to segment my mind to be like operator and then strategist, because I had to play two different roles, two different employees. People don't do that with their own life at all. Like I don't think people are very good at that. They're not observational. They're not mindful. So
how do you think they do that? How do you think somebody like our age, a guy that's working at whatever job, doesn't really matter, how do you think that a guy our age becomes more mindful to those types of things?
You got to ponder, Max, right? You're so stressed out from your day to day that you want to get some sort of reprieve by looking at TikTok or Instagram or watching a movie, right? Or going out and drinking. And that's fine. Do that. But you need to dedicate time to just sitting with your thoughts and thinking and assessing your actions, assessing your behaviors, and assessing your sense of self. You know, it's super important. And we used to do that so much. But now, because we're so easily distracted, it's so much easier and more stimulating to be on our phones all the time than just sitting and thinking. So out of all of the things, out of all the health hacks, out of all of the things that I recommend to live a better life, the most important thing you can do is just sit alone with yourself and think, right? And can you just layer it onto something you're already doing? Do you commute 30 minutes a day, right? Like if you're commuting 30 minutes back and forth from work, that's an hour of just thinking all day.
Yeah.
And I think driving is the perfect thinking time, because you're kind of forced to focus on something. So your
especially
mind,
for the ADHD types,
especially with ADHD, and we'll talk about those like stimuli sensors that I was talking about. But yeah, you know, I think that's huge. That's why walks are great as well. Nature, in my opinion, is just very inspiring to me, and I get a lot of really good insights in nature. But you know, I'm obsessed with nature anyway, which we're supposed to be. I mean, you think about the fact that some people literally go entire seasons without touching grass. I think some people, like, you live in New York, when are you going to touch grass? Like maybe you go to Central Park.
Maybe.
Not Central Park is probably also just absolutely contaminated.
Yeah,
with
I wouldn't imagine people going to Central Park and also like grounding there.
Yeah, and even if like the amount of electricity in the ground,
that's
like,
a good point
dirty
too.
EMF. But yeah, I mean, people go their entire lives without touching grass, which is crazy.
Yeah, that's one of the things too that I've noticed. So my 5th year of baseball at VCU, I was like a year into like sort of esoteric health stuff, like grounding, sunning my balls, eating like whole foods, eating liver, just like all those types of things. I got pilled. Honestly, I got pilled because of Solbra and Liver King were like my two entry points.
Yeah.
Which, talk however you may about those two guys, I'm grateful to both of them, just because of like they literally opened my eyes to a lot of these health things. And I remember being like, before we get on a bus trip to go like 10 hours, all my teammates would be on the bus, or they'd be wearing their shoes or whatever, and we would both load the bus at the same spot. I would be shoes off in this little grass area, getting as much sun as I could until the very last second that we would be on the bus. And they would always take pictures of me, literally, and like have the thought bubbles, because I would just be standing out there like looking at the sun, and they would literally have the thought bubbles, and that kind of ties into like the ponder maxing.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that people look at and are like, that's so strange. But I 100% notice a difference. And it's such a simple thing.
Well, it's so funny because that's literally how we just spent our time for the entirety of human existence.
Yeah.
Most of history and all of prehistory.
Yeah.
Right? All like the entirety of our existence, and not to mention like since like we were animals, right? If you believe in evolution. But it's so crazy because now we have to make time for it. We have to go out of our way to live how we're supposed to live. So for me, it's like, I don't want to do that. I was talking with a friend last night, and he's like, yeah, like I love living in the city. You know, I just got to go to nature once a month and like I get my fix. I'm like, nah, I need to do it every day.
Yeah.
Like I need to do it every day and then go visit a city once a month, like what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
I think that's the best way to live. I think that you really don't make that many compromises. Everyone wants to make excuses to why they have to live in the city. We live in a completely decentralized world at this point, right? Like ever since I started business, like it's always been remote. And that was before COVID. That was before remote work. It's always been available, and now it's just common. Like it's just common. Like I started a business on a rooftop with Starlink and 3G. Like I could do that, and it was actually quite simple if you learn how to play that game. Like people really don't have, I guess, the testicular fortitude or the creative insight to go in and say, like, what would a life look like if I could get everything I want from this modern world while living a little bit more evolutionarily accurate lifestyle.
Yeah, there's back to your comment about the SSRIs. I've been throwing this thought around recently about like the idea of painkillers and how we kind of microdose them throughout our day, throughout our life. And it stemmed from a conversation I had with Will Harris from White Oak Pastures. He said nothing happens until it hurt. Essentially, nothing happens until it hurts enough that you're going to change. And the reason I think so many people stick into this like just blah lifestyle, they don't like change, they never evolve, they're just like literally the same person over and over again, is because SSRIs, maybe they're taking those. That's a painkiller more or less. It kind of numbs you to things. TikTok, Instagram, porn, excess drinking, weed. All these things are just microdoses of painkillers that never let you feel that like little bit more pain that you need to feel to be like, oh shit, something's wrong, let me change it. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense.
I feel like we're all inundated with those types of things. So if you can escape from them for long enough, you're gonna probably feel some like, oh shit,
yeah,
I'm like not where I want to be. But then you're gonna be able to change it.
Well, that goes back to what we were talking about. We have built-in mechanisms that are supposed to signal to us when something's wrong, right? Our spidey senses, our intuition, that's what it's built for.
Negative emotion in general.
Negative emotion, right? That forces us. That's why we feel pain, right? That's why we feel pain. That's why we have nociceptors, is to tell us, don't do this. Get away from this. Go do that. That's why we have pain and pleasure pathways to begin with. So yeah, you're numbing it with all of these artificial things that we have no context for in our biology, right? Like we don't know what to do with because we had no context for that. We can't evolve within the last 50 years or 100 years since the invention of morphine or whatever the alternatives are. So, that's why I'd say like I'm grateful for being prone to, feeling bad or like depression. And it's like now it's really not concern at all because I've been able to remove all of the things because I listen to it. And people just don't listen to the depression. People don't listen to the negative emotions that they have.
Yeah, I was listening to Jordan. We went to Jordan Peterson live, like me and Harry, Brett, and a good group of guys. And he said something about negative emotion to the effect that like it's essentially a signal that you're not living in alignment with your aim. Something to that effect. And I'm like, oh, that makes total sense. And another example, like more recently, was I was talking to a guy who lives out in like a little bit outside of Austin, and I walked into his gym and he had like this scorpion trap, and it's full of scorpions. I'm like, holy shit, dude, I didn't know there was that many scorpions out here. And he was like, basically talking about how his daughters, they teach his daughters, because it's like I tell them to put shoes on when they're running in this area, and they don't, and they get bit by the scorpion, and then guess what they do? They wear shoes when they're running through this area with the scorpion. So it's kind of like this idea that you need pain. Have you ever read the book or heard of the book, The Gift of Pain? I think you would like it. I've never read it, but a physical therapist of mine back in the day recommended it to me. It's about like leprosy and how most people think leprosy, as far as I understand it, I could be botching this, but people think it's like a disease that you can like spread or something like that. But it actually is like a neurodegenerative disease, I guess, where your pain receptors are out of whack. So like you get all these sores because you can't feel the pain. Yeah, so like,
wow.
So the book is basically about how pain is actually a gift, because people with leprosy, for example, literally can't feel pain and then they injure themselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the reality. Every single mechanism that we have as humans is there for a reason, right? So if you're inhibiting anything that's a natural signaling pathway, you're gonna have a bad time, right? And that's why I'm very apprehensive and cautious about supplementation now. As someone who, you guys, like you came into it with the whole holistic health approach. I got into health from the pharmacological, how can I fix my brain, right? And then, I realized that, the real key is nature. Like the real cure was when I said, screw it, I'm done with everything. I'm moving out of the city. I'm going to stop biohacking. I'm just going to go live on the beach. Like I'm done.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, like I just got better. Everything got better. That's really interesting, and it's true. And I do believe that, I don't know when this came about, but like something flipped on me, I think like a year ago, that just like everything happens for a reason. Super cliche. So true though.
Yeah.
And I think just having that belief, I'm just so grateful for all of the bad things that have happened and the fact that I was able to be robust enough to power through them. And I think that's really interesting because the same thing can happen to two people. A horrible experience can happen to two people, and one person will be destroyed by it, and one person will be forged by it. It's like Arnold. I read the Arnold documentary or watched the Arnold documentary, and like he had a brother, and him and his brother both grew up in a very tough environment. I think it was an abusive father or something.
Yeah.
That shaped Arnold, that destroyed his brother, and his brother died of alcoholism or suicide. I don't remember. But like that kind of idea, it's like, you want to be robust enough to grow from the pain instead of be destroyed by it.
Yeah.
And I kind of just live by that. But yeah, I think like all those bad experiences are so important.
Well, it's interesting too, like back on the painkiller / like city, the beach, like the jungle, those environments are more, they are the antithesis of sterile. They are more wild, like literally, like there is more danger in those environments. You get, that's how you build resilience, at least in my experience in my young life. But it's interesting to me how it seems like society has this pull towards the sterility, like of the city and of like the secure job and all this stuff, and it's at the expense of being like a sovereign, resilient individual. So it's really just like the idea of you have to pick what you're going to sacrifice. It's either going to be security and stability or your freedom to actually choose.
Yeah. And I think some people value stability, and that's okay. Some people value stability, some people value security. There is a subsect of person that doesn't value that at all. I don't like the concept of security at all. I'm just like driven by novelty, and I think there's that subset, like the hunter types that I always talk about, that just are driven to new experiences and for the what ifs. And I think a lot of that comes down to genetic predisposition. Within any context of any civilization or tribe or whatever, there's always a subsect of that tribe who had an insatiable urge to leave and go explore new lands. There's always been that archetype in all of human history. Right, and actually, that comes down to like they've kind of correlated it to a certain gene variant, like the DRD4R7. I think we discussed it last time, like the wanderlust gene. And once you realize that, and once you're like, oh, that might be me, like that checks out, everything makes sense, and you no longer have to feel bad or you have to feel like you have to compensate for like, your natural proclivity. And you can kind of just live that out, and life gets a lot easier.
Didn't you say that Native Americans have like a disproportionately high? Like they have that gene at a higher proportion.
Nomadic tribes, nomadic groups, which a majority of humans were nomadic at one point.
And then those are the people that are more susceptible to like a gambling addiction, correct? Just because it's the novelty.
The stimuli, right? More susceptible to addictions. They need to hit that stimuli threshold. And if they don't do it in a natural manner, it gets taken up by the much more stimulating like creations of modern culture.
It's so interesting how like gambling, I mean, even your phone, I guess, I've heard like TikTok or Instagram referred to as like a slot machine, essentially. How all those things literally tap into like all these hardwired things that we have, and that's why people get so addicted to them.
Yeah,
it's pretty wild.
It is, and you know, I developed software for like 2.5 years, and my objective was to make the software as like hooking as possible because we wanted retention, right? We wanted to reduce churn, and we wanted to make it addictive. So I read, Hooked by Nir Eyal, and I really got into color psychology, and I got into all these things about how can I make this as addictive as possible and gamify it. Yeah. And once I did that, I realized how much I was being hooked and addicted by video games, by social media, and I deleted all social media. I stopped playing all video games, and I was like, I'm not letting this happen to me. So sometimes you don't realize it until you start to do it yourself.
Well, you saw how the sausage was made, or whatever they say. It's like you saw it and you're like, oh shit, I'm not eating any sausage.
Saw how the sausage was made, exactly. But yeah, it's interesting. There was something else I was going to add there. We were talking about Native Americans and their susceptibility to gambling addictions, and then from there we were talking about the addictive nature and the gamification. Now, one thing, like everyone's like, I wonder what drives me and what motivates me. Am I driven by linear progression or am I driven by novel stimuli? Go back. I'm sure all of us played Call of Duty. Like, what did you like more? Did you like the mystery box where you didn't know what the reward was going to be? It was a variable reward. Or did you like the linear progression of upgrading a gun? For me, it was always the mystery box. So, that's a good cue. Like, what was your what was your crutch in video games?
On the what was it? The zombies. Where you could pick one up off the wall, or you could go to risk your life and go to the mystery box, and it could either be like a pistol or like a ray gun.
Yeah, which one are you? That's how to do it.
That's
Just
interesting.
Play zombies and see what they do.
Yeah, a little self-discovery via Modern Warfare 2 zombies, or Modern Warfare World at War zombies.
World at War zombies, baby. Incredible. Yeah, actually, I still play zombies. Zombies is a great game.
Dude, I was severely addicted to Call of Duty when I was like probably 5th through 7th grade.
Same.
Like, could not stop.
Men crave war.
Yeah.
We've always craved war. That's why all the video games are war-based. We love war movies. We love war documentaries. Like, everything's a war. And I think we just crave some form of conflict because, like, that's just what we grew up in.
Yeah.
You watch any old movie, like Troy, like, the kids are already fighting at a young age. And we've completely been deprived of that in modern culture and society. That's why I think martial arts is so important. Martial arts is so important. It brings back this brotherhood that's kind of been taken from us. I don't think society likes men congregating together and making each other strong. They don't like that. They want to sterilize you. They want you to be homogenous between genders, right? They want you to not have that barracks feeling. And that's why I also think it's important for you to get a bunch of your guy friends and to go and live in a house together. Go somewhere maybe just for a month. Go live with each other, hold each other accountable, train hard, have some competition. I'm very competitive. Everyone's very competitive. One of my best friends, we're just so competitive with one another. We do everything together, but we always kind of want to beat each other.
Yeah.
So we're outside just beating the shit out of each other.
That's how it's always been, though.
That's how it's always been.
That's how it's always been. And I was talking to Eric last night, and he said that y'all get in a disagreement and just like scrap.
Yeah, we'll punch it out. But by the end of it, like that is how you build camaraderie.
Yeah.
You know, and like that's why you'll notice relationships evolve so quickly in the context of jiu-jitsu or in martial arts.
Yeah.
You go and you fight with someone. At the end of the day, you shake hands, and like now you feel like you know that person. And I think that physical touch is also something that's so important to humans, right? Like that's how we get oxytocin, is through physical touch. And that's also something that's been deprived of us, especially after the pandemic and the lockdown. We are no longer allowed to physically touch each other. And it's so important, you know, it's been deprived of us. You got to go and you got to fucking scrap it out, you know?
My buddy Greg Lappin, who I had on the podcast, he brought this point that I'd never thought about before, and it actually has since changed my behavior. Talking about COVID, talking about the lack of human touch that we have, or human interaction. It's like literally you can go through your whole day without interacting with a human being one single time in real life. Like you could work a remote job, you could wake up, go to the gym, have your headphones on, not interact with a human being, come home, work a remote job, go to the grocery store, go to self-checkout, leave, watch Netflix, whatever. And he said he stopped going to self-checkout, and I always go through self-checkout. I'm like, huh, interesting. That is a way that they're like, not they, or like, that is a way that I'm being deprived of some human interaction. So since then, maybe like once or twice when the lines are super long, but I've gone to like the regular checkout, and every single time it's been like a pleasurable experience. And I thought to myself, how many other times throughout our life, how many kiosks there are nowadays. You can go to McDonald's and not talk to somebody. There's kiosks everywhere. Go to Delta or wherever. And it's one of those things I feel like we need to bring. This is kind of like another tangent, but like analog. I think we need to bring analog things back. We need to bring back not being in a rush all the time and being able to take 3 extra minutes to go talk to a person at the grocery store. I think that's absolutely crucial, and I think martial arts is probably the best way for young men specifically. I can't speak for young women, but like young men specifically, I think that's one of the best things you can do. Sports in general, really.
Yep.
Just any sport.
That's right. They want you to be socially isolated, right? Because it's very controllable. And the issue with all of these modern conveniences is that they scratch your itch enough where you don't take action, but you're not actually getting the real thing, right? Tinder scratches your itch enough for dating, but it's not the real thing, right? Postmates or social media scratches your itch enough for socialization, but it's nothing. It's not even comparable to the real thing. Now, you are really, I mean, I always tell myself this, you're one social interaction away from being in a good mood. That, like, there's nothing I love more than interacting with strangers, putting a smile on someone's face, and it's a progressive skill, too. Like, you got to fall in love with just getting good at things for the sake of getting good at things. Every single thing you do is an opportunity to get better. You're going to eat 2 to 3 meals a day, every single day for the rest of your life. Why not get progressively better at cooking, right? You're going to have conversations every day for the rest of your life. Why not take a growth mindset and get better? And that's the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. A lot of people that have poor social skills, right, that are introverted, quote unquote, they'll have a social interaction, it'll go poorly, and then they will retract. They'll retract back into their cave. They're like, this is why I don't socialize. Now, if you remove all the stakes and realize that they're going to forget about that interaction entirely, because no one cares about you as much as you care about yourself, and then take that growth mindset and see like, oh, I messed up here and here. Here's what I'm going to do differently next time. Get those reps in. Like, that's how you progress and become hyper sociable. So, you know, I find that to be the factor, a huge case, and then also living in a small town community. When we think of social interactions now, we think of hanging out with our friends, our peers. But in reality, social interaction in a typical context is interacting with a wide variety of people in your community, right? The old lady that lives down the street, the person that you get your groceries from, the butcher, right? Every single person. And you really can't get that in the US anymore, in my opinion. You probably could in some small towns.
Yeah.
I've only found that in like small beach towns.
Yeah, small beach towns, maybe some small rural towns. Definitely some small rural towns. Like I'm thinking of a couple people I know in Georgia and in Texas where they live in like a stoplight town, and they know the butcher, they know the farmer, they know the gas station tenant and all that stuff. So yeah, I think that's awesome. Have you noticed? Because I mean, you speak Spanish a little bit as well.
I'm fluent, yeah.
Yeah. So when you go down to Mexico and wherever else that speaks Spanish, I would assume it's much easier for you to do that and like build a relationship with these people that you're going to these small towns with. Is that the case?
It's everything.
Yeah.
That is how you inundate yourself with the culture, is to learn the language. Because language is culture.
Yeah.
It changes the way that you express yourself. Like, you think differently when you're speaking a different language. And also, my grandpa was an immigrant. He came from Iran, and he was always very astute. He's like, if you live in a country, you must take up their language, you must take up their culture, and you must take up their values, right? That is your obligation if you're going to live in there. So I'm very, very particular about that. I hated living in Mexico, and there were all these gringos that spoke no Spanish. They had no adoption of the Mexican culture. Meanwhile, that's the purpose of travel. That's the purpose of being a nomad, is to embrace these cultures. So I just get such a bad taste in my mouth with this digital nomad movement.
Yeah.
People go to Bali and they won't talk to a single Indonesian, right? You go to Mexico and you live in Mexico City and you just live in this bubble. And I think it's atrocious. And I think that people are warranted to hate that movement. But I guess, you want to integrate. Like, integration is where the real magic happens.
How have you balanced that? Because we were talking a little bit about you coming back to the States, living with your boys at Tropical Anabolism HQ. How do you balance the desire to go do that sort of exploration, nomadic side of life with the integration that you're talking about with your friends back here, if that makes sense?
Yeah. There's seasons for everything, right? So I'm doing a season here in the States, but I'm going back in a month.
Yeah.
In a month and a half. So, I think it's really just about always reassessing your priorities and objectives, understanding that there's seasons. A lot of people, they have such recency bias that they think the thing that I'm doing now is going to be the thing I'm doing for the rest of my life. That is never the case. If I'm doing everything that I'm doing right now, 6 months from now, let alone 5 years from now, I've failed miserably. So, I think just realizing that it's a season thing and making sure that I'm always prioritizing the ability to be mobile. Prioritizing mobility, the fact that I can tomorrow move anywhere I want in the world and not have a lot of negative impacts, right? So it takes some sacrifices. I can't get a dog. I really want a dog, but I can't get a dog because of that for the time being. Yeah. But I also know that my desires are going to change as I get older, right? When I'm in my 30s, I want to have a family and I want to have kids, and that's going to require making some roots. And I still am going to be able to live that half and half lifestyle. A lot of people see my content and they're like, yeah, this is great. Just wait until you have a wife and kids. But it's the lifestyle that I'm living, my friends have a wife and kids, and they're doing that just as well as I am, if not better. Yeah. So a lot of it's it's cope. Yeah. A lot of it's cope.
How do you think, because obviously there's a temperamental spectrum, I guess, and hunters on one side, you could say a farmer, or the opposite of you, a person that's not your temperament. I don't know what you would you call it? Would that be called a farmer in relation to that?
Yeah,
analogy?
Farmer, linear.
What do you to those people? Are there people, do you think, that actually are better suited in that environment where they're hey, I need X, Y, and Z to be the same for the rest of my time?
Yep, 100%. Yeah. And that's completely okay.
Yeah.
Right? But that's also what is pushed on us anyway. So it's just important that we vocalize this other side, right? Because there's a lot of people that aren't like that, but they feel like they have to be.
Yeah.
And they do so much better if they got out of their hometown. There's some people that are happy in their hometown, and that's completely fine. That's good, right? And that's admirable, and that's accurate too. You're supposed to stay close to family, and I'm still close to family too. But there's some people that aren't. So to each their own. You just really need to be self-aware and understand which one you are, and you do that by experimenting.
Yeah.
If you've been living in your same town for the last 27 years, go out for a little bit. It's going to be there when you get back, right? If you've been traveling everywhere for the last 4 years, go stay somewhere for 6 months or a year and see what happens.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because it's sort of like the recency bias that you were talking about. I feel like that will stop a lot of people because they're like, oh, there's so many things here that I like. What if I end up liking that lifestyle and then not wanting to come back, and those things those connections or ties will be severed, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But kind of the same point. It's you will change as a human being regardless.
And distance makes the heart grow fonder.
There
are so many things that you are taking for granted right now that if you were to deprive yourself of them for a little bit, would mean so much more to you. And you realize it, I especially realize it now with family. As I'm 26 now, and as I'm kind of maturing and developing, I feel a really strong responsibility to kind of lead my family. Parents getting older, I'm the oldest of my siblings, so taking care of them as well. That's really, really important. But I was not able to get that until I moved to a different country and didn't really have much interaction with my family for a little bit, because you need to make that space to change. You have to realize that you are the way that you are because there are external stimuli that are tying you to that person. Right? You probably notice it when you go and you hang out with your college friends, that you get this pull back to being who you were back then. So you need to make that distance so you can change without those distractions and without that pull coming back of you being the old person you were. So, I did that with my college friends. I completely removed myself, and it was in isolation because I had to reinvent myself. And now I can go back with confidence and security in who I am without feeling like I'm getting pulled back into that old version of me.
Interesting. Yeah. You mentioned your parents. That just like raised a thought in my head about something you've tweeted about a couple times recently in terms of influencing people around you, specifically your parents because they're older than you. How has that changed for you as you've changed, as you've evolved in your like health maturity journey?
It's a great question. So, for context, my parents were both very smart. And we like definitely butted heads because I was a stubborn kid. I knew what I wanted, and it was the case with teachers, and it was the case with everyone. I knew what I wanted. People are always like, "You're a dumb kid. You don't know what you want." I did, right? And I knew what I wanted, and I'm living the exact life that I wanted when I was 16, and no one believed me. And it's such a cliche thing. No one believed in me, but that's not the case, right?
Yeah.
Like you could understand that people are skeptical. Always, people will always be skeptical. But that doesn't mean anything. But I really knew what I wanted, and I think it got to a point where my parents kind of accepted that, like, all right, he's going to go do his own thing. And because most people, when like their kid moves to a foreign country or like goes to school in like Thailand, they're like, "What is this guy doing?" Like,
gonna go move to Sayulitas. It's like, what the?
Yeah, what? Where the hell is that? Like, you're gonna get
Don't
a
you have a college degree?
Yeah,
That's really what it's like.
So, I had to make that segmentation. And, I think what a lot of people mess up with is they're always looking for validation from their parents. And that's important. What else do you want to make your parents proud? That's really important. But people look for validation, or they either look for validation or they feel like they blame their parents. And that's the worst thing that you can get in. You have to understand that like your parents are people too, right? They've gone through things that you probably can't even imagine. They've had very hard lives too. And you kind of got to get over that emotional hurdle with your parents, especially as you get older and that dynamic changes. Because the dynamic does change, and you have to embrace that. You have to meet them where they're at, and you have to kind of rebuild that relationship in a new and more mature manner. But if you're able to do that properly, it's probably one of the best things that can happen. You're kind of stuck with the family that you have. So you have no other option. And feeling vindictive towards your family or feeling resentment towards your family is going to get you nowhere. So I think it's kind of rambling onto that question about like now going from like where your parents never listen to you, where they're actually heeding your advice. It's about treating them as mutuals and treating them with respect and meeting them where they're at, as opposed to like I see a lot of people interact with their parents where there's like this tension. There's this tension because you're in this context of like, you guys raised me. The dynamic used to be very hierarchical, and now it's kind of more at a level. And it's very interesting, like, because I'm just getting into it now that I'm back in the States and I'm able to see them often, and it's incredible. Like, I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful for like the relationship that I have with my parents as I've gotten older, and it feels good, man. There's nothing that feels better than taking care of your family.
100%, and that's that from me. Like, I would say I've had sort of that not vindictive, but I've definitely been like, I've questioned like, how do you guys not do this? Or how have you not done this? Why are you not doing this, this, and this? And then the other day I literally stepped back and thought, I'm like, wait a second. My parents bought a sauna because I recommended it. They have a cold tub because I recommended it. They have red lights all throughout their house because I recommended it. They put a reverse osmosis full house water filter because I recommended it. And it's like, oh, maybe they are listening. I'm just being an asshole. Honestly, like, seriously, like maybe it's like, you need to take stock of what's actually going on. It was just interesting for me to have that thought. I'm like, wait a second, they're like actually doing better than they were, and I'm just like willfully not seeing that. And the other thing, my mom shared with me this quote a long time ago, and it was like, part of maturity is realizing your parents are growing up too. And it's so true, dude. Because like we think, at least for me, like I've had this sort of subconscious thought where like, oh, maybe when I'm like 45 or 50, I'll have it figured out. It's like, bro, I'll die on my deathbed not having it figured out, God willing. I mean, it's just interesting how that changes.
It's so interesting because when you're a kid, you think that adults are infallible. Yeah. I remember looking back at all of the adults in my neighborhood and being like, man, these guys are they're gods. They're demigods, right? They have it all figured out. And then you hit a certain threshold. For me, it was when I was 23. I don't know what it was, but I immediately just started looking at adults as wrinkly kids. And I saw all the problems that they had, and they were nightmares. The lack of development, the lack of maturity, the personal and internal conflict and strife. And it's crazy. So I think realizing that, it comes down to empathy. Yeah. Empathizing with your parents, empathizing with older people. But man, ever since that happened, I look at everyone as kids.
Yeah.
And, it's this intuitive thing too, it comes down to physiognomy as well. Like you can really get a good sense for someone and like what they've been through just by looking at them. But when it comes to the parents, I do think a lot of it is the emotional baggage that comes with your parents. And, if your parents don't listen to you, it's your fault. And you have to look at everything that way. You have to identify what's in your locus of control. Believing that it's their fault doesn't serve you. And sure, maybe your parents messed up somehow. They could have done something better with parenting. But you're an adult now, so like you have to figure it out. It was so crazy. I was on YouTube the other day, and there was this video where it's like how to tell how good your parents were, or something like that. And it had like 6 million views.
Yeah.
That many people want to blame their parents for their problems. That does nothing. That does nothing. And I guarantee if everyone went and they took their problems they had when they were growing up and threw them on the table, you'd take yours and you'd run home with them.
Yeah.
Like everyone has issues growing up. So it's like, get over it. You're yourself, right? Stop feeling victimized. Have a sense of agency and do your own, like create your own life. Like it's your responsibility.
It's interesting you said the YouTube point. That's such an interesting point because it's not even that it does absolutely nothing. It literally does one thing and it makes you a victim. It victimizes you and it basically takes away your ability to say they did something that wasn't optimal or whatever. Blaming them takes away your ability to change that. Yeah. So that's a really interesting point. You just brought up physiognomy too, or however you pronounce that word. That's one of my most. I'm like fascinated by it because I really think that our eyes, our brain are wired to tell us things like intuitively, quickly, because that's how we delineate like in times of stress, like whether it be hunting or whether it be in war or battle. Like we have these circuits in our brain that tell us things quickly. And I feel like as we've quote progressed or in modern times, we've sort of downplayed those intuitions, the physiognomy intuitions. What's your take on that?
We were bred to judge books by their cover. The modern world wants you to think completely rationally, right? They want you to make decisions based off of statistics and data, right? Because they want to remove these natural intuitive things that identify when there's bad actors. But we have to understand that the rational faculties of our brain, the thing that enables us to have reason and to think about things intellectually, is very recently, like it's a recent adaptation. Yeah. And it's not fully developed. Like we get so easily tricked and fooled. That's why optical illusions work. That's why magicians are a thing, is because we're so easily fooled. We barely have a comprehension and grasp of the real world. So we were bred to make 99% of our decisions intuitively. If you were coming over the hill right now, and I never saw you before, I would need to make a split-second decision of what your intentions were. I wouldn't have time to be like, well, maybe he's a nice guy. Like, oh, yeah, he seems pretty cool. Let me ask him a few questions. You'd have to make a split-second decision, friend or foe, right? So we are intuitive creatures. It's called gut instinct for a reason. I do believe that in order to regain that intuition, you have to become attuned to it. You need to be mindful. You need to get back in nature. You need to fix your health and fix your gut. But we are intuitive creatures. ADHD people are especially intuitive. They're incredibly intuitively driven. Their rational faculties will not serve them well. I used to be overly rational because that's a way to feel like I have control over the world. You don't. The second I stopped listening to my rational thoughts and I just went with intuition, I haven't made a bad decision since. The second I get overly rational with something, always a poor decision.
How did you overcome that like desire for rationality or that
pain?
Yeah.
Remember?
Yeah, good point.
Making a rational decision. For me, it was taking a business opportunity in New York because it was it made sense on paper. On paper, it was perfect. I get there, day one, moving to New York, I left in a week because I was like, this is the worst decision ever. I came back home. You got to make assessments, right? Yeah. Like you need to integrate those things. And I was like, where did I mess up here? People don't ask themselves that question, right? Because they'd rather mope. Yeah. They'd rather mope and sit in their bed. But no, you have to go and you have to sit with those feelings. Like, where did I mess up? I made a rational decision when I should have listened to my intuition. Ever since, I just always listen to my intuition.
Yeah, I can't imagine you, of all people, living in New York. Do you know who Laird Hamilton is?
Yeah, of course.
Freaking legend. We might have even talked about him before. He's a role model in a lot of ways for me in terms of like lifestyle design and overall just the way that he goes about life as a almost 60-year-old. Mm-hmm. He's the same type of way. He's definitely like ADHD, and he absolutely hates New York. And it was the first time I ever really thought about it from not like an EMF perspective or anything. I remember him talking about going to New York and saying the buildings just put him in fight or flight.
Yeah.
Like there's just these massive buildings surrounding you, and he just noticed like instantaneously, he's like, I need to get out of here.
Yeah, Laird is hunter type to a T. He is hunter type's a spectrum, right? He is on the furthest end of that spectrum.
Yeah.
That guy cannot be compatible in society.
Yeah.
But because he is so atypical and because he's so incompatible, you're pretty much destined for greatness if you can align with that. I see a lot of people with ADHD and hunter types. They occupy the ends of the bell curve, right? You have the median here, and then you have the outliers like of detriment, and then you have the outliers of success. They're always on one side or the other, and they're usually a few decisions away from being a complete, deprived person living in detriment or hyper successful. But think about how unnatural it is to be surrounded by thousands of people that you don't know. There is no context in human history where that would ever make sense. That's going to make our senses go haywire, right? We're meant to live in small communities. And you don't really understand that until you go and you live in a small community and you see the same people you see every day and you're in nature and how much it changes you. You've seen the before and after photos. The only thing that I changed there was I lived in a beach town. Yeah. Right? And like stopped living an artificial life.
Yeah, your like before and after is actually pretty wild. I'm sitting here laughing. Have you seen Alex Jones's?
Yeah, I got roasted so hard for that. Someone did that on mine because I was like, I look the same, just tanner.
Bro, those pictures had me laughing. But on this point, yesterday, I had not an interaction, but an experience. So I was at coffee shop in East Austin, and I'm sitting there doing some work, and through this window, I'm like it's hard for me to go to like a public environment and not stressed out, but like I don't like I very, very, very rarely will like just completely let my guard down when I'm out in public. I don't know why. It just is what it is. So I'm like, that's why I don't like really working at coffee shops unless I'm like in my own little area and I know like 3 sides are blocked off so I can see. But nonetheless, I'm sitting there and I look through the windows of the front door and there's this homeless guy with his pants off, literally ass out, walking through like the patio. And this is kind of to speak to like how removed we've gotten from that intuition or how much like it's literally been like culled out of us. This dude is screaming he's like cracked out, literally cracked out, screaming at himself, yelling at people. Literal ass is out, visible. And there's people on this patio acting like nothing is going on. Literally just like typing on their computer, like blank stare. I'm like, I'm sorry, do you guys not see the crackhead that's literally 3 feet from you sitting down screaming at you? And they're just like numb to it. Do you think that's a result of like the modern society just like taking it out? Or like how because to me, I'm sitting there thinking I would never even I wouldn't even be close to that situation. But I'm trying to think how somebody could even allow that to happen and then act like it's not, if that makes sense.
It's learned submissiveness. It's like when they put a bunch of gnats in a cup and they cover the cup and they learn that they can't get above that threshold. Wow. You remove that and they're still there. It's learn submissiveness, learn helpfulness. We forget how adaptive humans are. We are the most adaptive species ever. That's why we've been able to be the only species that's populated every single continent other than Antarctica. Right? And of course, you've got like the vermin species that have followed us. But we forget how adaptive we are. And that if you spend enough time in an environment, it will become status quo to you. So that's, for me, why I switch environments so much. But yeah, I mean, I think that's also just like a reality of poor governance. Yeah. I'm gonna be honest. I love America. I love being an American. I really like true American culture. I don't like American cities. Yeah, and I just don't like being in them.
No, it's. I don't see to that point. I don't think that modern American cities are a representation of like American ideals.
It's not
at all.
American ideals have been kind of wiped away.
100%.
They're coming back though, baby.
Yeah, they're coming back, and the cool thing is like, especially in Austin, I've gotten to meet a couple people that are outside of Austin and in just like rural areas of Texas and also in Montana. And it's cool to see like the community, like the actual like community that these people build where it's legitimately like about as, not as pure, I mean, it's about as pure as you can get in America for sure, where it's like legitimately community that they interact with each other. Their kids go to school together. They share food. They do things on the weekends. They train together, all this stuff. And I'm like, that's freaking awesome.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool, but it's not the case in most cities.
It's still alive and well in some areas of the US. But you want to know what the real issue is? And this is something I learned while studying abroad, is the globalization movement is homogenizing all culture. Because I was in Bangkok and I was going to school in Bangkok, very globalized city. But then I go to these small villages, right, where they didn't even have phones, let alone social media. And it was true, authentic Thai culture. And that is probably my saddest, I guess my biggest regret of living in the time that we live in, is that we're not able to experience true individual culture because it's all been homogenized. These traditions and values that have been around for thousands of years are just being dilapidated and destroyed in one generation because the new generation have access to the internet, which is good, right? Better opportunity of life, quote unquote. They all move to the city, right? Now all of these small towns are void of that culture. It's no longer being passed down. And it's so sad. And it really, like, I think it's a good thought exercise to think of yourself in different periods and contexts of history. It's why it's very, very important to study history and anthropology.
This is why guys think about the Roman Empire.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what would my role be then? Because that's how we can best conceptualize it. What would your role be in a nomadic tribe? What would your role be in the Renaissance area? What would your role be in, feudal Japan? And you really have to think about that. And it's so enjoyable. I think it's important to romanticize life. I was talking with Brett about this morning. I was talking to Brett about this morning. We understand the world through stories, right? That's why every single culture is passed down. Every single society is passed down its culture via stories.
Yeah.
That's why the Bible is just a culmination of stories. Stories are how we comprehend the reality of this world. And that's why storytelling is so important. And that's why it's so important to also read stories, right? Because that's how we become inspired and understand the world.
Dude, that's so spot on. And that's another thing that Jordan Peterson, basically his entire 2-hour talk was about that. He was talking about how the world, you perceive the world, or another way of saying that is the world lays itself out to you as according to your aim, and your aim is really just a characterization of story, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly why you mentioned the Bible. You mentioned these movies, like that's why Gladiator is my favorite movie, because I watched that movie and I'm like, I like to think that I would be like him. It's just like it's these exercises. That's so true. And this, I have to bring this up, dude. This is so spot on. Have you seen the new Apple commercial for the iPad that just came out? Dude,
no.
It is exactly what you're talking about in terms of the homogenization of cultures, which is really disgusting in my opinion, because you're exactly right. Like you could go, it's one of the beautiful things about humanity is that you can go to Italy and have a completely different experience than going to Japan or going to sub-Saharan Africa or wherever. Like, it's just completely different. Apple released this commercial, and this is one of those times where I wish I had like a TV with Jamie. He's like, "Hey, Jamie, pull this up." But,
hey, Luke, pull this up.
Literally, bro.
Luke's in the back.
But it's like a hydraulic press, a massive hydraulic press, and it's literally just this press destroying paint, artwork, pianos, guitars, stuffed animals, like all these signify like the important factors of culture, essentially, of the human experience, and then it compresses them until they're all broken, and then it lifts up and it's an iPad. And I'm like, and Twitter's going crazy right now over it because it's atrocious because it reveals their true intention too, in my opinion. I don't want that. I want all of those things. You know what I mean? Like I want the piano, I want the art. I don't want just one freaking screen and that's sort of like a microcosm of what's going on globally. To your point.
The powers that be want to crush culture. They want to homogenize the population, right? Because if you are detached from your culture, cultures provide value, right? They provide that value system. So you're a lot more impressionable when you don't have that culture. It's atrocious, and it's so sad because that's what makes individuality and ethnic diversity so interesting is the culture component. And, I believe that it's why it's so wonderful, even going somewhere like Mexico, right, where they have been isolated due to geographical reasons, Sahara deserts and jungles and mountain ranges, and like the difference in each place. You can feel the spirit of that. But you go to every city in the U.S., it all feels the same.
Kind of on that note, I haven't really thought about this in this manner recently, but like the idea of traveling, that's one of the things that was good about, or that not, you can still do it, but that is good about traveling is that experience. Being that ability to experience other cultures and to see how other people are living. Now in America specifically, I feel like I could go to Charlotte, Atlanta, Dallas. I think Austin's actually a little bit unique. I think Austin, San Diego, and then like some Mountain West cities are a little bit different. But if you go to like the downtown CBD, Central Business District of all those cities, you're gonna almost to a T have a similar experience. if that makes sense. But it didn't used to be that way. It used to be like if you're going to go somewhere in North Carolina, it would be a completely different experience than going to a town in Kansas instead of like now it's just the exact same.
Because they evolved in isolation.
Yeah.
You know, the only way that culture could cross-pollinate is if someone moved across the country and did that.
Yeah.
Now it's immediate.
Everyone's
on the same trends.
Yeah.
Everyone's on the same memes.
What's because I saw this tweet today about or maybe it was a video about like clothing, or Alex Hormozy actually talking about clothing, and then I saw one about Tucker Carlson talking about clothing, how you want it to be simple and how you want essentially about like essentialism of your closet and clothing, but how it honestly is just like a principle of life. Have you read Greg McCow's Essentialism? We might have talked about that.
Yeah.
What's your thought on that in terms of like just actually like from a clothing perspective? I'm curious.
I don't want to garner my sense of self from any external good, any external item. So clothes, I don't like wearing name brands, right? I don't want it to be because I have a certain car or a watch that is borrowing credibility from something else. That's why we buy brands, because they reaffirm our identities, right? You know, Simon Sinek always says people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So I don't like that. Like, I want my sense of self to be very close to my core, and it's a game that people play, the status game. But I want my status to come from my capabilities, right?
Yeah.
I've always noticed that because everything that I've always done, I wanted to be void of external crutches, right? Even with sports, I always liked combat sports because it was something that I was doing with my body. I wasn't throwing a football. I wasn't, hitting a ball with a tennis racket. I was doing something with my body and my body alone. I didn't need gear. Same when it came to marketing, right? Like, I like the fundamental principles of marketing and business more than I liked any tool. I never learned how to use an ad manager. I really didn't do that much Photoshop. I eventually got into like design, software design, but I was still focusing on the fundamentals because no one could take that away from me. That was core to myself. You can strip yourself of the tools. I mean, what's a tennis player without a racket, right? Yeah. You can strip yourself of all your clothes, right? What's a rapper without his chains and his Gucci?
Yeah.
So I never liked that game. And it's really about what games you want to play. And sometimes it's best to just excommunicate yourself from the game entirely. That's why
go ahead.
That's why I just don't play certain games. That's why I never played the salary game, because I never wanted to get golden handcuffs. I just excommunicated myself. I said I'll never take a salary.
That's interesting. So, okay. Talk to me about games then, because you mentioned gamify and you talk about gamify your life. That's something that I've heard Jocko Willing talk about. I actually listened to one of his podcasts one time and I loved it, about the idea that the first step to winning a game, and I've mentioned this before, the first step to winning a game is understanding that you're in one, and the reality is we're all in one. We're all in one, and then underneath the game of life is thousands, if not more, games. How does that manifest in your life? How do you gamify your life?
It's a great question. Once again, first of all, what Jocko said, you have to understand that everything's a game. Everything's a game. Like, we understand the world through games, right? Because I think games are the way that we can get this natural competitive nature out, right? For me, I personally gamify things because it makes it enjoyable. And once again, using self-assessment and pondering, you think about, when did I perform the best? In what context did I get the most outcome from? For me, it was always games that were low stakes because I just enjoyed playing games. Mm-hmm. Cool, I'll just gamify everything, right? So there's a myriad of gamification techniques that you can do, right? I think first and foremost is just taking things lightly. For me, I don't like taking things seriously because I don't perform well when I take things seriously. So everything's a game. It's a lot less of a a stress on it. But you really just reverse engineer what makes a good and compelling game. Why do people get obsessed with Skyrim? Well, there's an overarching objective, right? The objective is to kill the Elder Dragon, right? That's the big goal. But within that goal, there's a lot of trials and trepidations along the way. But it makes it doable, and you're willing to grind through those because you know what the end goal is. And while you're doing that, there's a myriad of side quests as well. So you need to structure your life up where there is an end goal. There's that dragon that needs to be slayed, and then keep novelty in the books with with side quests.
Yeah.
Right. Constantly progressing, upgrading those skill trees, really looking at yourself as a creative character and romanticizing that and embracing that. Right. You also got to have some background music too. So I think that's super important. That's why I always listen to music when I work. Now, you have to gamify that. You have to understand that, because you have that end goal in mind, it makes these periods, right, these chapters of the game make more sense. And you know that just because you're in this chapter right now doesn't mean that that's going to be the next chapter. It's different. And you kind of embrace that newness. You embrace that linear progression along with the novelty of side quests. So I think that's really important. But really, it's for me, it's just about increasing the competition finding what drives you and what motivates you. For me, it's competition, collaboration, pressure, performance, and fun and creativity.
Yeah.
So like I just make things fun. I make things creative. I make things like pressure. I love like performance. That's why I love stuff like this, because you have no other option but to keep talking.
Yeah.
When I'm writing, like I can get distracted and there's not a penalty.
Yeah.
If I get distracted right now, like there's a penalty. So it gets you dialed.
Yeah.
That's 100
If we just stopped talking, it'd be a pretty shitty podcast.
Yeah, exactly. We'd have to start over.
Yeah, that's interesting, dude. One thing that you just mentioned, or like kind of on the game, I'm thinking about like Call of Duty and how the goal, like, so the goal is like 10%. I don't know what the goal for online would be, like when you're playing with other people, but like I guess the goal would be to like get to the top prestige. But then every time you get to the next prestige, you go back to level 1. So there's like this the way that I envision that in life is like you take these levels up, you're gonna have to like idiofy yourself, if that makes sense. Like you're gonna have to there's a higher ceiling, but then you go back to like a higher floor too, if that makes sense. But you still go to the floor. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense.
And that's something I've never thought about until just now. It's like you have to be able to, some people would just, and I remember this, some of my friends would just stay at like level 70 first prestige.
Yeah.
Because they have all the guns unlocked and all this stuff. They would never prestige.
Where are they now though? That's the question.
I think some people do that in life. That's wow, I've never thought about that. Call of Duty just dropping.
You have to understand. You got to play archaeologist with your own life and realize that your understanding of the world is oftentimes predicated by your experiences you had as a kid. And for us, it was video games, right? So it makes total sense. And one of the biggest takeaways I had about myself was when it came to like goals, right? And Call of Duty in particular, I would work my ass off to get the golden guns. I always wanted the gold guns, right? The camos. I had to do all these challenges. It was a huge pain in the ass. I spent hours doing that, and I was so dialed. The second I got that gold gun, I never used it again, right? And I went and I started with a new one. And that's the whole point, right? Is because the outcome for me, like I'm not driven by end objectives. It's a good placeholder for me to aim at because you got to aim at something. But I know it's never going to bring me happiness. It's the process, right? It's the process and the objective and the enjoyment of that section of that like objective, chasing that objective. So it's a huge factor.
Yeah, Hormozy said something to the effect of, like, you have things now that you once said would make you happy. And then, I think that's exactly what you're saying.
He's got great one-liners.
Dude, he does, bro. I don't align with, like, a lot of his stuff, but I think there's another quote, not from him, but, like, the idea of, like, wisdom is being able to entertain an idea without being able to accept it. I think a lot of people would, like, not like one thing he says and then not take anything he says with any grain of salt. I, for one, do not align with a lot of stuff that he does, and even like a lot of the way he lives his life. But I do think he has some some objective knowledge to pass on. I think he's a very good like follow, somebody to consume content of.
Well, that's the biggest pitfall of most people, right? And I think a lot of like, I guess, intellectually underdeveloped people, which is the majority of people, is that they're unable to entertain nuance, right? They have to take everything at face value, and they have a very binary perspective of the world. Everything is black and white. You either have to like someone or dislike someone. But in reality, like, everybody has qualities that we can admire and that we can dislike. Like, I'm sure if you knew everything about me, there would be some things like, okay, I dislike this about you and I like this about you. That's the case for everybody, and that's okay, right? Because you can compartmentalize what you like, and you can take that and you can implement it in your own life and become your own version of yourself, because you don't want to just be a cookie cutter version of someone else. Yeah. And then you can identify areas where you're like, I don't like this about him. But what if I took his good qualities and I implemented those, and then I focused on his negatives as well, and I did something different. But that's why, like, when it comes to a lot of people in the health space as well, it's so primitive the way that we look at it, where it's like, oh, like everyone shits on Paul Saladino because like Paul Saladino, what is wrinkly or something, right? And it's like everyone is so hypercritical when it's like, all right, not everyone's perfect. Like, you can disagree and still like someone. And I'll always say that because, like, yeah, I really like this person. And then someone's like, oh, but he does this and you don't do that. I'm like, and what? Like, that's okay.
Yeah.
So that's a really big pitfall that everyone falls in.
The other thing about Paul Saladino that I've noticed is people, especially on Twitter, people dog on him for, like, changing his mind. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I'm like, is that not sort of the goal, like to like evolve? And I don't know, for me, I'm like, that makes total sense. Like, he tried something full-fledged for a handful of years, and one of their arguments is that he like told people and stuff like that. I don't see a problem with that, because he's basically just incentivizing or encouraging people to experiment with their own lives. And then he takes the data and he said, you know what, I'm better off doing this. And then he does that, and people are like, see, he's a charlatan, he was fucking lying this whole time. And it's like, no, he was just experimenting and relaying the information, which I think is awesome.
Yeah. The biggest issue with social media is that it's given a voice and a platform to troglodytes. And
You're going to have to tell me what that means. I've never
it's
heard
like cavemen, cave dwellers, right? That have no critical thinking capacities whatsoever, that have really loud mouths, right? The vocal minority.
Yeah.
Just idiots. And that's why I'm so disenfranchised with social media in general. Like, I don't really go on Twitter much anymore. I just focus on creating. Like, it is a nightmare. And we're not meant to be exposed to this many people. Like, there were idiots for all of human history, but they were relegated to the small confines of the town, and they never left. But now they're just fucking blasted in front of you. I post something, and it's just all of these little cave dwellers from across the world trying to give their opinion like it matters. So I think that's the reality. That's the harsh reality, and I'm very hypercritical about it because, like, I've been exposed to it. I've worked with social media for like the last 4 or 5 years, right? And I've been creating content for the last 2 years. And you just get exposed to these people. It's like you should not even be allowed to have access to the internet.
Yeah. And then the other thing is the reality of the situation is that what we consume is influences us. It's the same with music.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same with TV, whatever, the people you're around. And so this is something I've thought about recently. And I try to keep my following, and this is like intentional, I try to keep my following lower, like underneath the Dunbar number if I can, which is 150, I believe. Just because... And I try to be intentional with who it is because if I see somebody's tweet, I'm like kind of giving them a license to say something to me or like to influence me in some way, shape, or form. And that's why I love Rogan's idea of like just never checking comments.
Yeah.
I think that's so smart. The post and ghost.
Post and ghost.
Yeah. Because I mean, think about if he checked all of his comments and if he was like genuinely concerned with these troglodytes that you mentioned. I'm going to be saying that word a lot more recently.
Great word.
Yeah. His life would be miserable, and then you like lose sight of who you actually are, who you want to be, because you're letting these people from our mutual friend Zach. He always talks about the arena, man in the arena quote, and the critics, like the people not in the actual arena, are those folks.
Mm-hmm.
Very rarely will you see, maybe unless somebody tweets about like Tyro Glass, will you see people that have like big accounts that are not anonymous actually like dog on people.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And once you realize that the people that are the most vocal almost always are projecting.
Yeah.
It's almost always a projection because you realize that in yourself, right? You realize that when you're pissed about something or like some behavior of somebody, oftentimes it's because something that's a little bit repressed in you that would also want to do that, right?
Yeah.
Like when you see people flexing or like showing off, you get kind of mad at them, but you'd probably do something similar. Like there's part of you that wants to do that. So when you realize that, like a lot of people that are commenting are just damaged, they're insecure. It's just like, it's almost comical.
Yeah.
It is quite comical. And you don't let it get to you. But if you expose yourself to it 24/7, we see a lot of really intelligent people, a lot of really successful people spend so much of their time and energy responding to just random anonymous people on the internet. Like, what's his name? I'm not going to remember his name. It's very common in the health space. And I think there's a reason for that because a lot of people that hyper-focus on health are coming from areas of insecurity, of lacks and deficits in other areas of their life. Mm-hmm. So they double down on this. So they don't have a lot of development in other areas. They're very deep, not a lot of breadth and width whatsoever. So then they don't really know how to handle that situation.
Yeah.
So you got like the most genius health influencer, health guru ever that is just obsessed and glued to a screen arguing with anonymous people on the internet. It's like, buddy, you got played.
Yeah.
You got played. So
yeah, that they win in that instance. One thing I just thought about too is, I mean, the people you live with are from Twitter, right? You met them on Twitter or online. How does the idea or like the paradigm of creation over consumption play itself out for you, especially on Twitter? Because obviously that's where like I'm sure the large majority of your time creating for social media has been on Twitter. How has that sort of evolved over the time that you've been using it?
I was never a big consumer, ever. I was never a big consumer. I was in the beginning before I started creating. The second I started creating, I didn't consume much. And also keep in mind, like I was doing a lot of this without even like internet access. Yeah. So I would literally like write on paper or write in my notes app and then just transfer it over. So it was just like overemphasis on creation. I didn't really have like, I think an important thing with that is to not be concerned with the outcomes. Because I'm not playing the social media game. I'm playing the idea game. I'm trying to synthesize my own thoughts into tangible, sensible things on paper. So I'm playing a different game.
That reminded me of the salary comment you made. You're not playing the salary game. Has that been something that you've kind of always done? Have you always sort of not been driven by money, or because that's such a compelling and motivating factor for like the vast majority of people, specifically in the West and in America. Is that something you've always sort of found in yourself?
Yeah, I've never been driven by money, ever. I think I knew just very early on that money wasn't going to make me happy at all. And a lot of times when I was in a position of like, things were nice, it made me feel worse, because I was like, why do I have all this stuff and still feel unhappy? So that was just so deeply ingrained in me that like money was never an objective. And when my business really started taking off when I was in my early 20s, it was the same thing. Like I got like the biggest invoice I've ever collected and popped up on my email, no emotion whatsoever. And I was like, all right, cool. Well, I know that money's important. I know that it's an essential for freedom in this life, but it's never going to be the driving factor. And I do believe if I focus on myself, money's going to be an inevitable byproduct. But also, you got to look at like what's the worst case scenario and what's the best case scenario. For me, if I lost all money today, all revenue generating capacity today, I'd be living on a beach on like a very low burn rate. And if I had all the money in the world today, I'd be living on a beach with a very low burn rate. Like it's really the same thing. And it really just comes down to what your values are. Yeah, is a nice car cool? Sure. Is it going to bring me happiness? No. Would it be fun to have as like a side quest? Yeah. So like honestly, to me, I guess business is a way of just bettering myself. It's a personal development endeavor. Absolutely. It is a proxy for personal development. Because like if I want to just improve myself for the sake of improving myself, that's great. But if I have to improve myself because that's what's required of me due to my environment and due to the people that are dependent on me, I just become better than myself. I perform really well when I'm forced to perform. So sometimes I have to force myself to perform, and I do that by just taking on more responsibilities. And man, do I get dialed.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think people need more responsibilities, not less.
I think everybody needs more responsibility. And because it's the idea of like you see these dudes hit like 10X's when they become fathers.
Yeah.
You also see the opposite. But you see some dudes become a father and then like their life changes because it's like the amount of responsibility that they have, the amount of
pressure.
Yeah, the pressure. Literally, it's like, okay, well, this is why I also think you see the exact opposite where they can crumble, but it's the same idea with pressure. It can cliche, it can make diamonds. But it's just interesting. You also mentioned something earlier that I wanted to touch on. You said, what was it? When you were basically saying like when you don't care, you perform better. I can't remember the exact way that you said it.
Yeah. When everything's a game.
Yeah, dude, that's in my personal life, and I've spoken about this before on the podcast as well, but like I played baseball at Virginia Tech, and it was so important to me. It was so serious. I had a goal of being an MLB pitcher. It was like so serious. I took myself, my training, my routines, all this stuff very serious to the point where I became neurotic, and we've talked about this before. But then I went to my 5th year, and I like legitimately stopped. I just like didn't care. I still worked hard because I liked working hard, and I liked the pursuit of being good. But like I didn't have that goal like overarching over my head and like weighing on me, and it's not that I don't want to say I didn't care.
The pressure was off?
It was. I still wanted to do well, but it was just like I didn't have this like serious. It wasn't so serious to me, is another way to put it. Like I remember my coach one time telling me, because like I was never late. My coach always said, "Be ready to be ready." If that means 5 minutes early, if that means 20 minutes early, if that means whenever. I was always ready to be ready, but like it would probably just be like 30 seconds before it would have been late, if that makes sense. But it was just like this sense of relief, and I performed significantly better. It probably because it became more of a game and less of like I have to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it comes down to just taking an assessment of your life. Like everything that I've been consistent with and I've done for a long time, for me that's fitness, right? Like I've been fit my entire life pretty much. And I've got pretty high level of fitness, all things considered. The only reason that I've been able to be consistent and perform with it is because I've never had a goal. I've never hit a number that I wanted to hit on the scale or a number on the bench. I've just been doing it for the creative pursuit and endeavor and enjoyment of it. And I've been able to do it every single day for my entire life. Same with diet. Like I just love eating real food, and it's just fun to me. Like I don't really care. So I like some people just perform better without goals, and that's okay. Now, does that mean that you shouldn't have goals? No. But just realize that maybe you just need to switch up some variables, change your mindset and your perspective and your lens of this thing that you're pursuing, and it might completely change the way that you approach it. And I realize that too, because it's like sometimes when I'm like really there's a lot of pressure on for me to do something, I can't do it, and then I'll have a drink. And the drink is a great disinhibitor, right? It's myopic. You don't have that default mode network telling you like, oh, this is really serious.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it becomes effortless. And it's so interesting to me. And I use alcohol as a proxy for that ability to get into that carefree mindset. So I think that's a huge factor there. I definitely remember like when I was playing tennis, I'd get so much pressure because, you know, like my dad was watching and like everyone was watching when we were playing normal matches, and I'd choke.
Yeah.
But we'd play lob ball, which is like this tennis game where it's like it's just all fun. And no one could beat me in it because it was just a game. Which is funny because like tennis is also a game.
Yeah.
But no low stakes game.
But we like don't treat it as such, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like one of the great paradoxes of life, because life is high stakes. Like it's literally your life, but it's also at the same time the way you make the most out of that high stakes game is almost treating it as if it's like a low stakes game, or like walking through it as if it's low stakes, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Life is very paradoxical.
Oh, absolutely. I think Matthew McConaughey talks. Have you read Green Lights?
Yeah, great book.
The mandorla, like the almond shape. Do you remember that?
No.
So he talks about
Swiss cheese memory.
Yeah, dude, this is one of my favorite parts about that book. He talks about I don't know how you say it, mandorla. It's the almond shape like this, and it's the inside of a Venn diagram. You know, like the a Venn diagram, the middle where both things are true. Which you can kind of just say it's a paradox. It's the place where two things are true that are not related. It's the middle of a dichotomy. And you see a lot of like old religious and spiritual pictures, specifically of Jesus, in a mandorla. But he talks about it that he's like, that's where the answer is. It's like two things that are seemingly totally unrelated or almost like counter to each other. It's like that's where you find the answer. And I think you talk about dogmatism all the time, and I'm in alignment with your beliefs on that. Like people get dogmatic about one end of the extreme, and then they're just missing the entire point.
Yeah. God, it's so interesting, that mandorla idea and like the coalition of opposites. And that's something that I tell everyone to pursue, and I personally pursue, is duality, right? Like so many people are one-sided, unilateral. They're either one thing or the other, right? But in reality, like the true cheat code to life comes when you're able to occupy both ends of a spectrum. Can you be extremely linear and rigid in thought while also being extremely high on openness? Like, can you occupy both sides of every single pendulum? Mm-hmm. And I think that's just such a unique advantage that you can have. And, you know, you have to ask yourself, like, what is the pursuit of life? There's many pursuits in life, but one pursuit that everyone can kind of take on is just to become the most competent version of themselves, right? Like the self-actualized version, and really reach their potential. And I think the best way to do that is to learn to occupy both sides of every single, bell curve.
How do you think somebody occupies both, or like learns to do that?
You have to remove like that desire for, I don't even know. I think some people are just born with it. I think it takes a certain caliber to be able to do that, right? To be able to be both creative and strategic, right? An operator and a thinker. And it's so, it's like polar opposites. I think like a good example is even with like me or like people with ADHD. It's like I operate really well when I have no schedule whatsoever and there's nothing on my calendar and everything's last minute. But at the same time, I was really, really good at operations and systems. Like that was a secret sauce for me with business, is because I was so good with operations and systems. But it was so like contrary to my natural tendencies.
Yeah.
And it's so oxymoronic, but it's almost like because you're able to see both sides, you get the full picture.
Yeah.
And it's something I can't even comprehend. But I think that's another thing too. It's like, can you, like with thought, like rationalizing thought and speaking and being able to like think about things very clearly, but at the same time, being able to think in a way that you can't even explain in words and comprehend, that's a little bit more abstract. But
yeah. Well, it's sort of on the weeds in that, because like for you as an ADHD, and I'm almost just like a question for me, because really, how do you get to that point where what do you need to do for you, Noah, to get into that place where you can think linearly, where you can, since you're not that way typically, like what do you need to do? What does the environment need to be like? What are the prerequisites for you to be able to get that like deep linear focus?
Stimulus. I think the prerequisite to all of that is to be able to segment your mind. And I think that's like to be malleable with your mind and like have a malleable mind. It's almost like method acting.
Yeah.
It's really what it comes down to. It's method acting. Like, can I method act as a linear person? What would a linear person do in this context, right? And like, how does linear thought work? But yeah, it's like going from linear to nonlinear thinking. A lot of it's just like externalizing mental problem solving. So like when I want to be a linear thinker, I'll use lined paper. Like I will literally think in a line, and that's how I take the nonlinear thoughts and I segment them. Right. So I think it really is just asking yourself, like, what would a linear person do here? Like they'd have a calendar, they'd have a to-do list, they'd have like a board and a strategy section.
Back to stories.
stories. You literally play a character.
Yeah.
That's what you do. You play a character. It's all method acting. It's all method acting.
Interesting. I've never thought about it that way, but it makes sense. It's kind of like monkey see, monkey do. Like, okay, if I want to be a linear thinker right now, okay, I know this person, they're a linear thinker and they're effective. What do they do?
Yeah.
And then sort of just implement that into your life.
It's like being a high performer. It's like people want to do high performance things, but the way to do that is to do things that a high performance person would do.
Yeah.
Right? And you just play that character. And that's a gamification aspect of it, right? I'm always talking about create a character. You can be multiple characters. Like who I am now living in the States and like being here in Austin is drastically different than who I am in a small town on the coast of Mexico. Like it's just characters that you play and you can interchange. And they all congregate and aggregate. And they're all you. They're just different versions of you. And like that's the reality is like we all have different versions of ourselves. You, Nolan, at your best is drastically different than you, Nolan, at your worst. So much so that they're two different people. And you're best off if you can literally segment those in your mind and you can make sure that the optimized version of Nolan is way more present than the suboptimal version of Nolan. Because I know exactly who the suboptimal Noah is, and he sucks. He's an asshole, right? And he's super self-conscious, and he's just like not social at all. And I know who the optimized version of Noah is, and he's the man. So I need to make sure that this guy is showing up, and I need to figure out what I need to do to go from suboptimal Noah to optimal Noah. And you create a toolbox. You create a toolbox of things that with beyond reasonable doubt will get you to that optimal version of yourself. And you do that through trial and error.
That's how you're saying that's how you get the toolbox.
Yeah.
Collecting the data, essentially.
Collecting the data. Yeah. It's like, I feel really good right now. I am the optimal version of myself. Why is that? What did I eat? How did I sleep? What activities was I doing prior to this? What type of work was I doing? What was I not doing? And then you're in suboptimal Noah, and you're like, I'm in this rut. What are things that I can do to get out of this? And you start testing. So for me, it's like, go have a conversation with a stranger. Go have a conversation with a friend. Learn something new, right? Take some notes on something. Read a book. Go out in nature. Make a really good meal. Get a really strong workout in. Go in the ocean. Get some sunlight. Play with animals. So I have 10 tools that I know that I can slowly go and do 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Eventually, that will get me to optimal version of myself. Sometimes it takes 1 or 2 of them. Sometimes it takes all 10. But almost always will that get me from shitty Noah to optimized Noah.
Yeah, that's so interesting to think about. And for some reason, it makes me think about like the idea when that little like, what's the word? I don't know what you'd call it, like the period when you change your environment drastically. And we talked about this a little bit earlier before we got live, but like you go to a new environment and for me, it's like invigorating. Like I'm absolutely at my best intellectually, physically, mood, energy, because I don't know, maybe it's like an adaptation to try to become accustomed to or like take stock of the situation as quickly as possible. But then you get into this rut. I feel like the rut is literally what that is. It's like just over and over and over again. There's no stimuli, there's no novelty, there's no change, and your body adapts to that too. Yeah. So it's almost like those 10 things are all, if you kind of take a step back, all those 10 things are disrupting the environment in some way, shape, or form.
Facts. If I'm in a rut and I'm in a really bad rut, I just move.
Yeah.
That's what I did for 3 years straight. Just move.
Yeah.
You always come back. Everything's going to be there when you get back. Just get out. Even like go from one apartment to another one. Yeah. Or even just switch up the furniture in your existing apartment. But in terms of what you were talking about why some people's brains just turn on when they go into a new environment, it's because you got to think of it from an evolutionary perspective. Again, if you're in the same cave you've always been in, you know all the variables around. You are in conservation mode. You want to conserve energy. You want to conserve and consolidate everything that you have in that space. But the second you go to a new environment, your brain turns into exploration mode. It wants to identify the threats, the opportunities, the resources around you, right? And I notice it so vividly when I go to a new place, right? When I'm in my old environment, my head's down. I'm not explorative at all. I'm just focused on what I already have. The second I go into a new environment, my eyes light up. I'm like literally looking around and I can feel the physiological signaling of being in exploration mode. So, you know, some people just perform best in that environment. At the very least, it's always just good to switch it up. Yeah. And I think you never know who you could be unless you test out new like versions of yourself. That's why sometimes I like going and being like, what does City Noah like? Right? Because it's been a while since I've done it. And I'm like, it's not that good. But like, anyway, I'm glad that I tried. Yeah. You got to go
data point.
Yeah, you got to take whatever you're doing, do the polar opposite just for the sake of experiencing it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was talking to a buddy last night about the idea that everything's a data point if you want it to be. And
it's all data.
And you can literally just plug and play, like sort of what you said earlier. Like, okay, what was I doing when I was optimal? What was I doing when I was not optimal? What was I doing when I was in the middle? And then actually literally take stock of those things and then implement. Obviously, I mean, maybe not obviously, I for one want to be optimal, Nolan, as much as I possibly can. So then just take stock and then implement the data points that make you optimal in your life. That's so interesting. And the only thing, it's so true. The only way you can take stock and actually learn those data points is experimenting. This is kind of back to the Saladino thing. Like, that's the only way. Can you name another way of being able to like learn data without experimenting?
No, it's all the scientific method.
Yeah.
Hypothesis, experimentation. Data gather, research, hypothesis, experimentation. Constant iterations of hypotheses and then experimentation.
It's fascinating. Didn't you say what was your major in college? Because I'm trying to think if like, was it scientific related?
Marketing.
No way.
Yeah.
What's like where did the love of like the scientific exploration, experimentation stuff come in? Data gathering?
Well, there were so many things that were outside of my control as a kid. And I had, I wanted to be a control freak. There were so many things that I couldn't control. I couldn't control my size. I couldn't control how I felt, And I couldn't control variables in my life, and it frustrated me so much. So I garnered a really strong sense of a locus of control. What is in my control? What can I manipulate? And a few of the things that I could always manipulate was my diet and what I did with my body. So I trained a lot. And I ate a lot, and I realized that had influences on my behavior. And then that kind of got me into supplementation. And also remember, my primary care provider was ramming me with drugs this entire time. So if she sucks, it's on site if I ever see Dr. Maya. I'm just kidding. But anyway, so I just always kind of focused on my locus of control. Ever since I was a kid, though, everything made sense to me within the lens of evolution. I was obsessed with dinosaurs as a kid. I was obsessed with Pokemon as a kid. I was obsessed with the natural world as a kid. And I really just understood that like I was, in a toxic environment. Like I was just in a toxic environment. But yeah, it was just like about controlling variables, right? And like starting everything from like first principles approaches. I never really took influence from teachers or conditioning or anything like that. Kind of just being oppositional. But in terms of asking like why science, is that kind of what you're wondering?
Yeah. Like where did the interest in like the scientific method and all that stuff come?
It's a good question. My parents are both in science, so I think that was a factor. And like obviously they weren't teaching me science or anything, but I think it's kind of hardwired in you. Biology just always made sense. Mm-hmm. Some things just come easy to you. Chemistry does not come easy to me. Physics does not come easy to me. Biology is second nature, right? Because it's the natural world. It's the observable world. I can observe these things happening. So I think that was a factor. But I think a lot of it was just being dissatisfied. Like I was just dissatisfied with so many things in my life. And a lot of people just accept that as is. I was stubborn and I just didn't accept bad things. Like I just never accepted bad things. If something was wrong, like I would fucking do anything I could to change it. And I was stubborn. So it was just that, like just brute forcing my way through constant experimentation. And also I think just being more interested in novelty than stability. So like even if I had a good thing, I'd rather go do something else.
Interesting. How do you, is there a balance to that, do you think? Like too much novelty?
Yeah, it's a treadmill. Like it's the hedonic treadmill just with novelty and stimuli. So, do I know where that balance is? No. But I think the most important thing is we see a lot of people that are tinkerers, right? They'll go and they'll do something for a few weeks and then they'll drop it entirely and they'll go on to their new thing. And that causes a lot of cognitive dissonance and identity issues because they'll be obsessed with something and it'll be their entire personality, right? I'm sure you've seen that. Some dude that picks up guitar and now he's a guitarist.
Yeah.
3 months down the line, he's doing something else. Now he's a coder, developer, dubstep producer, whatever. But
that's a hell of an arc.
Yeah, it's a hell of an arc. But they're not interchangeable. They aren't contributing to an overarching goal. What you need to do if you are a constant tinkerer and a novelty seeker is that you need to find umbrella goals that will complement your natural proclivity for novelty. So for me, I'm a ridiculous tinkerer in fitness. Like I never just do the same thing. I switch my training up on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. Like I'll completely switch it up. I'll be doing judo 1 week and then the next month I'll do like exclusively calisthenics. Next month I'll just only be swimming, right? So I'm constantly doing these side quests in fitness. But those are all I'm not making linear progress in those. They're all contributing to my umbrella goal of fitness, right? Mm-hmm. And that is uniquely suiting me to be a very well-rounded fit person. With writing, for example, and content creation, that is the umbrella goal that is actually complementing my obsession with a myriad of different things, right? Because if I was just talking about one thing only, I'd be a one-trick pony.
Yeah.
But that's complementing that unique proclivity for novelty. So it's about identifying umbrella goals, right? Like with cooking. I love so many different cuisines. Every meal is different, but it's contributing to my goal of nutrition and learning how to cook.
Interesting. The umbrella goals. I haven't thought about that. But for somebody with a temperament like ours, or a hunter-gatherer temperament, that definitely makes sense to me that it would be, because like you from like a tribal perspective, the umbrella goal would be to survive, but then the tinkering would be with different hunting tactics or different hunting tools or different hunting locations and all these things, but it's all underneath the umbrella of getting your hands and mouths on meat. So that makes, that was kind of gay.
Yeah, cut that part out.
Yeah.
Acquiring food.
Yeah, literally, yeah, acquiring food. But that's so interesting.
Yeah, well, I think all men want to be very self-sufficient. Nobody wants to be a specialist. You look at who the specialists are nowadays, like they're usually bugmen, right?
Yeah.
Specialization is for bugs, so that actually checks out.
There's a book about that, correct?
Specialization is for insects?
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a great book called Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. I highly recommend everybody who feels like they've never been able to stick to one thing to read this book, because it'll bring a lot of context and it'll give you confidence in the ability to perform as a generalist. When I was first starting, my biggest gripe and my biggest problem was that I was such a generalist. I knew that my skills were very well suited for being high level. But when you're a beginner, you can't just go straight to high level.
Yeah.
I did, but I wish that I would have started like low level first. So you got to read that book, Range, and then you got to read So Good They Can't Ignore You.
Cal Newport,
because that'll teach you how to build and acquire skills that make you so good that you get your foot in the door anywhere, that you are you have perceived value that no one can take away from you. When I combined both of those, I was able to utilize my generalist skills while still taking advantage of the benefits that you get from specializing.
Yeah.
But, I think that everyone really does strive to be a Renaissance man, whether they know it or not. That's what we really want. I mean, that's what you want to be. You want to be competent in every area, right? Like a bodybuilder is going to get his ass kicked in a fighting gym, at a calisthenics park, in a CrossFit gym, in a marathon. Like, I want to be the guy that can, go and keep up in a weight room, that can go and keep up on a run in the CrossFit gym, in calisthenics, on the mat, in the ring. I want to do all of those. And I think most of us do, because nobody wants to be a one-trick pony. That is a modern proclivity.
Yeah, and it, much like you, I think about a lot of things from the context of like tribal living, and obviously with a tribe you have a smaller number of people, so the idea that it takes a village is legitimately real. And you can there's 100% people with different proclivities and different skill sets and different levels of competency and different things that survival requires: hunting, fighting, gathering, leadership, all these things. But in a tribe, a successful tribe at that, you would literally have to be able to do multiple things at a high level, or you would be ostracized. Yeah. You'd be a liability, and you would just be cut off. So it was like a matter of survival, and I think you're exactly right. The vast majority of people subconsciously do want to do that, but the way that society is going and kind of like funnels people is towards that specialist role. That's something that I've had just even in college and in school. This is why I think they put me on ADHD. Because it allowed me to fit in that box better. Like if I had to be in that box, I needed ADHD medicine to be in that box, or not ADHD medicine, Vyvanse, to be in that box, because without it, I hated the box.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
They want you to be, they want you to specialize, because then you are a gear, interdependent gear in the overarching machine. You are dependent on that machine, right? The more autonomous you are, the less controllable you are. I'm not saying that like conspiratorially, that's just facts, right? Like the more autonomous you are, the less you are dependent on systems. Now, the reason that they drug you up is because that's easier to get you and stay within those boxes. But that's the reality of being someone with ADHD, is that you have two options. You're either an outlier, you're just by nature atypical, so you're not going to be able to satisfy the midsection of that bell curve. Mm-hmm. If you do want to satisfy that midsection of the bell curve, you'll be relegated to mediocrity, and you're going to have a crippling amphetamine addiction. Like, there's no other way. You're going to be miserable. You're going to be and I've seen people do this. People with ADHD that bought in to the meme, that bought in to the lie of safety and security, because that's what they're supposed to do, but it's against their nature. And now they're on Adderall and they're miserable and they're slowly deteriorating, and it's destroying that same system that gives them all that spark and pizzazz to begin with. So.
Yeah, dude, that's. I honestly think that's like one of the. But the thing is, I think more people are like that than even they realize. Like, I think more people are on the hunter-gatherer side of the spectrum, which is a spectrum in and of itself. But they're on that side of the spectrum between like the farmers and the hunters and gatherers, then even they realize, because so much of life has literally just basically been told every part of that is bad. You know what I mean? Like, it's like society, every part of like what you're saying, honestly, you go to high school, you get indoctrinated, middle school, high school, college, corporate job, all of those organizations indoctrinate you to think that what you're talking about right now is bad.
Yeah.
And so it's just like this constant programming of like, oh shit, that's bad, so let me do something that quells it.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And, you know, I never listened as a kid. And a lot of people have oppositional defiance, you know, oppositional defiance disorder. That's what they call it when you think for yourself.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, kids got a lot of stuff wrong. I definitely probably got stuff wrong when I was a kid. But, you know, I think a lot of people are compelled to do the opposite of what people tell them. And a lot of times that performs pretty poorly, ends them up in jail and stuff like that. But there's some people that have that. And, you know, if you really can think independently for yourself, it usually pays off. And like doing the opposite of what everyone else does, you know, it will at the very least lead a very unique and independent life, for better or worse.
Yeah.
But if that's the game you want to play, you know, you got to play it.
Yeah. Speaking of games, what's the next game for you? Like, what's next on your radar?
You know, I came back to the States. I started going back into like real operator mode and like getting dialed, which has been great because I love the growth curve. And getting back into like really being like high level operator again is very rewarding for me. I love juggling a lot of pieces. I love having a lot of pressure on me to perform because it forces me to perform. But I realized that, you know, once again, it's not going to be the thing that brings me happiness, and it's not scratching my itch. So, you know, I think I'm just going to go back and go rogue again, go to like a small village in Cambodia or somewhere.
Yeah.
Do that, and, you know, go more rogue. That's what I like. That's what I enjoy. You know, I can do both, which is beautiful. I worked hard to build a life that enables me to be very mobile. So I want to go explore more. I want to go, you know, embrace some new cultures and assimilate somewhere, whether that's a small village in Japan or just back to Southeast Asia.
Become fluent in Cambodian, whatever they speak down there?
Yeah, well, you know, I was learning Thai because I went to school in Thailand.
Nice.
I went to a university down there, and, you know, that was a good language. It's hard. Tonal languages are hard. Spanish is a cakewalk.
Yeah.
So
I could see that. That's awesome, though. Dude, I appreciate it. I think we're like close to 2 hours. I appreciate your time, man. This has been awesome.
Yeah, man, this was awesome. Glad we got to do it in person. I think this is my first in-person podcast, too.
Really?
Yeah.
Here we go. I'll put it on Twitter. I'll put it everywhere. It'll be good, man. I without question, I think it's a different experience. I mean, we've done this before over a computer. It's a completely different experience being with somebody in physical space.
Yeah.
I prefer it 10 out of 10 times, but it's just a nature of the game.
It's so much better. There's no latency. There's no lag. You can actually really like flow.
Yeah.
You can just get into a total flow state, which is cool.
Absolutely.
And you're not forced to like looking at your own picture the whole time.
Yeah, and you're just staring at a screen, and now we can go get a freaking nasty pump in.
We will get a nasty pump in. I've drank probably 4 liters of juice this morning, so
Let's go, man.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, brother. I appreciate it.
Thank you, man.